My name is Amelia Carter. I am 28, and 15 years ago, my own parents threw me out when I was only 13. Last week, Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter arrived at Edward Carter's will reading, smiling like victory was already theirs. They came with a private lawyer, expensive clothes, and the calm certainty of people expecting to walk away with millions. But the moment Evelyn Brooks opened the sealed envelope, the confidence on their faces began to quietly fracture. Then Clause 7 arrived, and Vanessa Carter shot to her feet, her face drained white, her mouth hanging open. That reaction did not come from surprise alone. It came from the sudden collapse of a story she had told herself for years. Before I tell you what happened in that room, let me take you back to the summer that changed my life forever. In 2010, I was a 13-year-old girl who truly believed every problem in my family somehow began with me. We lived in a modest house in southeast Portland, where affection existed, but it was never shared equally among us. My father, Michael Carter, worked downtown as an auto mechanic and rarely said anything that challenged my mother. My mother, Vanessa Carter, worked a grocery checkout line and ruled our house with cold, measured certainty. My older sister, Chloe Carter, was 2 years ahead of me and always seemed to fit every dream my mother had. She had my mother's blonde hair, my mother's blue eyes, and the easy laugh that made everyone immediately adore her. People constantly told Vanessa Carter that Chloe Carter looked exactly like she had at that age, and she glowed. I looked like my late grandmother on my father's side, with brown hair, brown eyes, and a much quieter nature. My mother never called that resemblance ugly, but she never celebrated it either. And silence can bruise like words. The difference between us showed up in details so small and so constant that they began to define my entire childhood. For Chloe Carter's 15th birthday, my mother planned a real party with guests, music, and a tall bakery cake. For my 13th birthday, 3 months later, we sat at the kitchen table with a discounted leftover cake from work. The frosting said only "Happy Birthday" with no name, because it had been prepared for someone else who never came. I remember staring at that cake and feeling embarrassed for wanting it to mean more than it clearly ever would. I did not fully understand my place in that house until I turned 12 and stumbled into an accidental comparison. That was when I learned Chloe Carter had a college savings account opened for her when she was 5 years old. 8 years of deposits sat in that account, quietly growing into a future that had already been chosen for her. I asked my mother why I did not have one too, thinking maybe it had simply been forgotten somewhere along the way. Vanessa Carter looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if the possibility had never crossed her mind at all. She said Chloe Carter needed money for college, then added that I would figure something out because I adapted well. That sentence settled inside me like ice, because it told me everything without my mother having to say it plainly. I was the child expected to manage without help, without investment, and eventually without any claim to tenderness. By then, I had already become skilled at disappearing inside my own house and asking for as little as possible. I learned to keep good news quiet, dreams private, and disappointment hidden, because hope only made rejection sharper. Then the spring of 2010 brought the first opportunity that felt entirely mine, something earned by effort alone. In April, I applied to the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University without telling anyone at home. It was a 6-week residential program for students who showed unusual promise in science and mathematics across Oregon. The scholarship covered tuition, housing, meals, and materials, with a total value of $4,200. I kept the application secret because I had already learned what happened when I hoped out loud in that house. On May 15th, the acceptance letter arrived, and I opened it with hands shaking before anyone else could touch it. Out of more than 2,000 applicants, only 50 students had been selected, and I was one of them. For one full afternoon, I felt chosen, brilliant, and visible, like maybe the world had made room for me after all. That feeling lasted until Chloe Carter heard about a performing arts camp in California from her drama teacher at school. Her camp would last 3 weeks, offered no scholarship, and carried a price that landed like a family emergency. That night at dinner, Vanessa Carter announced her solution with the same calm tone she used for grocery lists. She said I would decline my science program because the family could not afford to send both daughters away that summer. Then she added that Chloe Carter's camp would help her college applications, as though my future carried less weight. I stared at my plate, feeling that old familiar shrinking begin, the one that usually kept me silent and obedient. but something in me had already moved too far toward possibility, and the word no escaped before fear could stop it. The entire table froze, and even the low hum of the refrigerator seemed to fall back from the room. My mother looked at me with the stunned expression of someone watching furniture suddenly speak and refuse instructions. She asked me to repeat myself, but slower, with that dangerous softness she used when anger had not yet exploded. I told her the scholarship was not family money to redirect, and that I had earned it on my own. My voice shook, but the sentence stayed clear, and for the first time, I sounded like someone defending her future. Vanessa Carter stared at me, as if I had crossed a boundary no child in our house was allowed to name. Then she said if I could not sacrifice for this family, I was not part of this family at all. I thought she meant it as punishment, an ugly sentence thrown in anger to crush my defiance before bedtime. I did not understand she meant every word literally, and that she had already begun deciding what to do with me. 3 days later, I returned from the public library and found my belongings packed into 2 black garbage bags. They sat on the front porch like trash waiting for pickup, mute proof that my place in the house was over. Vanessa Carter stood in the doorway with her arms folded, no longer angry, only resolved and disturbingly organized. She told me she had called Edward Carter, and that from now on, I would be his problem, not hers. I stood frozen on the porch, trying to understand how a mother could say those words without even looking shaken. Behind her in the hallway, Michael Carter was visible in shadow, silent as always, refusing even eye contact. I looked upstairs and saw Chloe Carter watching through a curtain, half hidden in the window of her bedroom. When our eyes met, she stepped back into the darkness and did not come down to speak to me. I waited on that porch from 6 in the evening until 10 at night with my knees pulled to my chest. My mother went back inside after only 5 minutes, and no one turned on the porch light for me. 4 hours is a very long time when you are 13, abandoned, and still hoping someone inside will change their mind. Edward Carter lived in Seattle, 3 hours away, and he drove through the night the moment she called him. When his gray Honda finally entered the driveway, I was still sitting on those bags in the dark and cold. He stepped out, took one look at me, and wrapped me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. He did not begin with questions or judgments. He simply told me that from now on, I had a home. That sentence broke something open inside me, because it was the first promise that had ever felt entirely safe. We drove north through the darkness toward Seattle, and I kept staring out the window, sure I had failed somehow. I did not know that while I waited outside, papers were being signed that would reshape my identity forever. I was just a frightened child leaving Portland behind, wondering what exactly I had done to deserve exile. It would take 15 years for the full meaning of that night to return, and when it did, it came with legal force. Edward Carter's house in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood was not large, but to me it felt almost impossibly spacious. For the first time in my life, I had a room that belonged entirely to me and no one else. More important than the room was the person who offered it, because Edward Carter believed in me immediately. Eisen. He had built Carter Property Holdings from scratch, after years of double shifts and relentless, disciplined sacrifice. By 2010, he owned 8 commercial properties across the Seattle metro area and understood risk better than most men. He never married and had no children. Yet the night I arrived, he made space for me without hesitation. He did not treat me like an obligation handed over by careless relatives. He treated me like someone worth raising. Over the next 4 years, I threw myself into school as if success could become the language of survival. I studied late, worked hard, and kept hearing Edward Carter's steady belief every time old fear returned. In 2014, I graduated from Ballard High as valedictorian with a perfect unweighted GPA and leadership roles. I was president of the math club, and for once, achievement no longer felt like begging for scraps of approval. The University of Washington admitted me with a partial scholarship to the Foster School of Business. I chose finance because numbers made sense to me in ways people often had not, and I liked that honesty. While earning my degree, I interned at Carter Property Holdings and learned the business from the ground up. I entered data, reviewed leases, handled tenant files, walked properties, and listened carefully whenever Edward Carter explained decisions. He never handed me shortcuts just because he loved me. He taught me to earn every level of trust. By 2018, I had finished my bachelor's degree in finance with honors and a GPA that reflected years of discipline. After graduation, I joined a large accounting firm I will call Mitchell & Partners to sharpen my technical skills. 18 months later, I earned my CPA certification and returned stronger, more precise, and ready for greater responsibility. In 2020, Edward Carter offered me the role of controller at Carter Property Holdings, and I accepted with gratitude. 1 year later, he promoted me to Chief Financial Officer because he had watched my judgment under pressure. On my 26th birthday, I managed a portfolio of 12 commercial properties worth $23.7 million. That same day, Edward Carter sent me an email with the subject line, "To my daughter," and I saved it. He wrote that I did not need to prove anything to those who abandoned me, only to myself and my own future. He called me worthy in that message, and those words reached places that childhood damage had left raw for years. During the 15 years after I left Portland, my biological family reached out exactly 3 times, and none felt sincere. The first contact came in 2012, when Vanessa Carter called Edward Carter asking for $5,000. She said times were hard, Michael Carter had lost his job, and family should help family when life turns cruel. Edward Carter refused immediately, and later told me they had not once asked whether I was safe or happy. They wanted money, not reconciliation, and he wanted me to understand the difference clearly while I was still young. The second contact came in 2016, when Chloe Carter mailed me a wedding invitation with no personal note. There was no apology, no question about my life, only a formal card addressed to me at Edward Carter's home. I did not go to the wedding, did not send a gift, and did not answer at all. Silence felt less cruel than pretending we had anything that deserved celebration or easy family photographs. The third contact came in 2020, when Vanessa Carter sent me an email with the subject line checking in. She said she had seen an article about Carter Property Holdings expanding and hoped maybe we could catch up sometime. I deleted the email without replying because success had finally made me visible to her, and that disgusted me. I was not carrying active hatred by then. I had simply built a life that no longer included them. In the summer of 2024, everything shifted again when Edward Carter received a devastating medical diagnosis. Doctors told him he had advanced congestive heart failure and perhaps 12 to 18 months remaining, if fortunate. He lasted only 8 months, and those final months passed with tenderness, paperwork, and difficult practical planning. During that time, he met repeatedly with his estate attorney, Evelyn Brooks, and revised his will carefully. In June 2024, 6 months before his death, he finalized the version that would later shake that conference room. I asked him once whether I should know what he had changed, but he only smiled and told me to focus on work. He said everything had been taken care of, and because he had never failed me, I trusted him completely. Edward Carter passed away peacefully on February 28, 2025, with me holding his hand at the hospital. Grief arrived quietly at first, not dramatic, just heavy, like the air itself had learned how to press downward. A week later, on March 7th, an unknown Portland number appeared on my phone while I was at work. I almost ignored it, but something about the timing made me answer, and then I heard Vanessa Carter speak my name. 15 years had changed many things, but not the way she said my name like a controlled test of power. She offered condolences for Edward Carter and mentioned the memorial service, pretending concern had brought her into my orbit. When I told her the memorial had already happened, she pivoted without shame to the will reading itself. She said immediate family had a right to attend estate matters involving a brother, especially one with significant assets. That was the moment the mask fell, and the real reason for her call stood fully exposed between us. I asked how she even knew about the reading, and she proudly named her attorney, Charles Whitmore. The name stirred a faint memory, because Edward Carter had once mentioned consulting that lawyer years earlier and refusing him. The next morning, I met with Evelyn Brooks, who confirmed that my suspicions had been correct from the start. Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter had hired Charles Whitmore to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence. They claimed I had manipulated a sick elderly man, isolated him from family, and pressured him to change his estate. They also demanded access to the will reading as immediate family, hoping public presence would strengthen their position. I stared at a framed photograph of Edward Carter on my desk and felt an odd sense that he had expected this. At Evelyn Brooks' office, rain streaked the glass on the 47th floor while she laid out the legal reality. She explained that even a weak claim could freeze the estate for more than a year if litigation dragged on. During that time, properties would still need oversight, bills would still need paying, and uncertainty could erode asset value. In other words, they did not necessarily need to win in court. They only needed to make pressure expensive. Evelyn Brooks said many estate challenges operated exactly that way, through delay, intimidation, and calculated settlement demands. I read the filing and saw Vanessa Carter describing me as the one who had abandoned my family and exploited loneliness. The woman who had thrown me out at 13 was accusing me of abandonment, and the hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. Instead, I asked Evelyn Brooks what evidence existed to prove what had truly happened when I left Portland. I told her I had been a child then, too frightened and confused to preserve records or think like a witness. She looked at me steadily and said that I might not have kept records, but Edward Carter almost certainly had. She called for an archived file, and 20 minutes later, her assistant returned carrying a yellowed folder from storage. Evelyn Brooks opened it carefully, scanned the top pages, then slid one document across the desk toward me. The heading read Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights and Transfer of Guardianship, dated July 15, 2010. I stared at the page, unable to breathe for a second, because the night on the porch suddenly became paperwork. The document stated that Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter had voluntarily surrendered all parental rights to me. It transferred full legal guardianship of Amelia Carter to Edward Carter, properly signed and notarized in Washington. At the bottom were 4 signatures: my mother's, my father's, Edward Carter's, and a county notary's seal. My hands shook because I had spent 15 years thinking I was discarded emotionally, not formally erased on paper. Evelyn Brooks said they had not merely kicked me out, they had legally given me away and severed the bond. As far as the law was concerned, Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter stopped being my parents that night. 7. I asked what that meant for their challenge, and Evelyn Brooks's expression sharpened with almost clinical clarity. She said Michael Carter had no standing to claim inheritance through parental relation because he had renounced it himself. Then she offered me 2 paths, the practical one and the painful one, both carrying consequences I needed to weigh. Option 1 was a private settlement, perhaps $500,000 to $1 million, in exchange for withdrawal. It would be faster, cleaner, and would spare the estate public drama, though it would reward pure opportunism. Option 2 was to proceed with the reading, allow them to attend, and place the truth on the record. Evelyn Brooks told me that Edward Carter had left specific instructions in case this exact challenge ever appeared. He wanted the facts disclosed publicly, not hidden behind a check written to people who had earned nothing. That night I sat awake in the house he left me, surrounded by photographs of every milestone he had witnessed. There were pictures from high school graduation, college, my CPA ceremony, and my first day as chief financial officer. In every frame, Edward Carter stood beside me, proud, present, and certain that I belonged exactly where I was. There were no photographs of Vanessa Carter or Michael Carter, not because he forgot them, but because truth mattered. I remembered his old words, that I owed myself the truth, even if I owed my biological relatives nothing. The next morning, I called Evelyn Brooks and told her to proceed with the reading exactly as scheduled. I wanted no settlement, no payoff, no secret deal designed to protect the feelings of people who had discarded me. Evelyn Brooks asked whether I understood that once made public, the details could never be quietly gathered back. I told her they had chosen publicity the moment they filed their challenge, and I was only accepting the arena. The will reading was set for Friday, March 14, 2025, at 2 in the afternoon on the 47th floor. The days before, it became a blur of documents, signatures, emails, and emotional preparation layered over fresh grief. My closest friend, Sophia Ramirez, helped me organize evidence in my office late into Wednesday evening. She had joined Carter Property Holdings as Human Resources Director 3 years earlier and knew the full story of my past. Together, we assembled emails from Edward Carter that documented his relationship with me and his estrangement from his brother. There were 47 messages across 10 years, each one showing his reasons were older than my arrival in Seattle. In 2002, Michael Carter had borrowed $80,000 from Edward Carter and never repaid a single dollar. That betrayal had damaged their relationship long before I entered the picture, despite what the challenge tried to imply. Sophia Ramirez also pulled the financial reports from my years as chief financial officer to establish professional competence. Under my leadership, portfolio value had risen from $17.7 million to $23.7 million. Occupancy averaged 96%, and tenant satisfaction reached the highest levels most in company history during that same period. Those numbers mattered because they proved I was not a manipulator feeding on illness, but a capable executive. On Thursday evening, I met with my therapist, Dr. Natalie Brooks, because clarity mattered more than anger. She reminded me that I was not pursuing revenge. I was closing a chapter built on distortion and fear. I asked whether feeling satisfaction when the truth surfaced would make me cruel, and she answered with a gentle smile. She said that validation was not cruelty, and that justice often feels sharp simply because lies grow comfortable. The real question, she said, was what I would choose after the truth came out and the room fell silent. Driving home through rain, I repeated to myself that Vanessa Carter no longer had power over my story. Only I could decide what access, if any, my biological relatives would ever have to my life again. On Friday afternoon, I arrived at the Morrison conference room 15 minutes early, dressed for calm rather than theater. I wore a tailored navy suit, simple makeup, and my hair in a neat bun that kept my face open and steady. Evelyn Brooks sat at the head of the table with two associates, already arranging papers with practiced precision. Also present were Daniel Foster, charity representatives, and senior staff from Carter Property Holdings, who knew Edward Carter well. The room's corner windows overlooked Elliott Bay and the mountains beyond, though the sky that day was entirely overcast. Evelyn Brooks nodded toward the seat reserved for me at the center of the main table. Directly facing her, I placed Sophia Ramirez's folder in front of me and waited, listening to my own heartbeat beneath the quiet room. At 2:03, the elevator doors opened, and the people who had once erased me stepped out together as a unit. Vanessa Carter walked first in a new black dress and pearls, dressed like grief had been tailored to flatter her. Behind her came Michael Carter, heavier now, eyes already searching for exits rather than confrontation or truth. Chloe Carter followed in a pastel dress that felt oddly misplaced, as if she had misunderstood the gravity of the day. Last came Charles Whitmore, silver-haired and polished, carrying a costly briefcase and the confidence of a courtroom predator. Vanessa Carter entered the room as if it belonged to her, surveying faces with dignified sorrow already arranged in place. When her gaze found me, she smiled faintly and said I was there early, as though we were merely delayed relatives. I answered with her first name only, Vanessa Carter, not Mom, and the shift landed harder than she expected. She asked to speak privately before things began, saying family matters should be handled between family members alone. I told her whatever she wanted to say could wait, because the proceedings were starting and privacy no longer mattered. Evelyn Brooks stood and informed them that seats along the wall had been arranged for attending parties and counsel. The main table, she said, was reserved for beneficiaries and estate representatives, not for people demanding symbolic centrality. I watched Vanessa Carter's jaw tighten as she realized she was being directed away from the center of the scene. Instead of sitting quietly, she began introducing herself to charity representatives with polished grief and strategic innuendo. She called herself Edward Carter's sister-in-law and claimed they had once been close before an unfortunate estrangement. Her meaningful glance toward me was meant to suggest that I had caused the distance she pretended to mourn. Chloe Carter added that Edward Carter used to visit Portland often and that she did not understand the seating choice. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore wrote notes as if recording every breath might someday help them distort the room. I kept my eyes on my folder because I had learned long ago that Vanessa Carter fed on visible reaction. Then she raised her voice and declared that a child rejected by her parents usually gave them a reason. The sentence landed like a slap in a room full of witnesses, and several people shifted with visible discomfort. Daniel Foster stared at Vanessa Carter in open disbelief, as if he had just heard someone confess without realizing it. For the first time in 15 years, I looked at her without the haze of longing, fear, or old confusion. She had not changed at all. She still needed control, still needed narrative dominance, still needed to be right. At 2:10, Evelyn Brooks broke the seal on the envelope and began reading with formal, measured authority. She identified the document as the last will and testament of Edward Carter, executed on June 18, 2024. She read the preliminary sections establishing identity, residence, and soundness of mind at the time of execution. Then she referenced a psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Andrew Kim, completed 8 days before the will was signed. That evaluation confirmed full testamentary capacity and no undue influence, which immediately weakened their opening legal theory. I saw Vanessa Carter exchange a tense glance with Charles Whitmore, their first visible sign of discomfort. Article 4 listed the estate assets, and the room's attention sharpened as the numbers finally began to accumulate. 12 commercial properties across 2 counties carried a combined assessed value of $18.2 million. Investment accounts held diversified equities worth approximately $4.1 million, with liquid assets totaling $1.4 more. I heard Chloe Carter whisper that the total was nearly $24 million, and Vanessa Carter's eyes gleamed briefly. Evelyn Brooks announced that the will contained 47 pages and would now move into specific bequests and exclusions. She turned to Article 5, the section regarding Michael Carter, brother of the deceased, and the room sharpened again. Vanessa Carter smiled at the mention of her husband's name, clearly expecting something substantial was finally coming their way. Instead, Evelyn Brooks read that no provision had been made for Michael Carter, and that the reasons must be spoken aloud. The smile on Vanessa Carter's face faltered as Edward Carter's own words entered the room like a verdict. First, he stated that in 2002, Michael Carter borrowed $80,000 and had never repaid any portion. He noted that 23 years had passed and that the original promissory note remained in his retained records. Michael Carter went pale because debt that old had just become moral evidence in front of strangers and colleagues. Then Evelyn Brooks read the second reason, and the room shifted from discomfort into something heavier and irreversible. On July 15, 2010, Michael Carter and Vanessa Carter executed a legal surrender of parental rights. That document transferred full guardianship of Amelia Carter to Edward Carter, witnessed, notarized, and permanently filed. Vanessa Carter shot to her feet and demanded to know what that had to do with inheritance or the will. Evelyn Brooks did not acknowledge the outburst. She simply continued reading Edward Carter's reasoning into the record. By terminating their parental relationship with me, they had severed any derivative claim through his chosen legal heir. Michael Carter now had no familial standing through me because he had surrendered that relationship in writing years earlier. Michael Carter stood too, insisting that blood brotherhood still mattered more than legal language drafted in some office. Charles Whitmore grabbed his arm and forced him back down, though the attorney himself had already gone visibly gray. Evelyn Brooks produced a certified copy of the guardianship transfer and placed it where everyone could see it clearly. Vanessa Carter stared at that paper as if it might explode, because lies are fragile beside original documents. She insisted the paper meant nothing, that blood still made us family, that legality could not erase motherhood. Evelyn Brooks calmly instructed her to sit down, warning that disruption of the reading would be taken seriously. Instead, Vanessa Carter pointed at me and accused me of poisoning Edward Carter against his own family. The charity representatives looked deeply uncomfortable, but no one interrupted because truth was finally unfolding in complete view. Chloe Carter tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered that people were watching, but panic had already taken over. Then I spoke, and my voice came out so calm it surprised even me, shaped by years of hard rebuilding. I told Vanessa Carter that 15 years earlier, she put my belongings in garbage bags and left me outside. I reminded her that while I waited in the dark at 13, she went inside and signed me away legally. The conference room fell silent with the kind of silence that only arrives when denial collides with fact. I told her everything happening that day was not my revenge or Edward Carter's cruelty, but the result of her choice. I said I did not hate her, yet I owed her nothing because she had personally ensured that outcome. Vanessa Carter opened her mouth, but no answer came, because excuses sound thinner when witnesses are listening carefully. Evelyn Brooks then said she had not yet reached Clause 7, and that the reading would continue as written. She turned to page 12 and announced Article 7, the designation of the estate's sole beneficiary. The room seemed to hold its breath as Evelyn Brooks read the next sentence from Edward Carter's will. He bequeathed the entirety of his estate, property, investments, cash, and personal effects to Amelia Carter alone. But the word that destroyed Vanessa Carter's final hope was not beneficiary. It was daughter and then adopted. Vanessa Carter's face turned completely white, while Michael Carter asked in a hoarse voice, since when that was possible. Evelyn Brooks answered that Edward Carter had formally adopted Amelia Carter on September 12, 2012. Because Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter had already relinquished their rights, no further parental consent was required. Chloe Carter stared at me and asked whether that meant I was no longer related to them legally at all. I met her eyes and told her not legally, not since our parents signed the papers and severed the bond. Evelyn Brooks continued reading, and Edward Carter's own language filled the room with devastating clarity. He wrote that I was his daughter in every way that mattered, legally, practically, emotionally, and through daily life. He wrote that I had worked beside him, proven my integrity, and earned his complete trust beyond doubt. He declared there was no one more deserving of the inheritance, and no one he loved more deeply. My vision blurred because grief and gratitude collided at once, and I realized he had saved these words for this room. Vanessa Carter shook her head slowly, whispering that it could not be legal, and begged Charles Whitmore to answer. But Charles Whitmore did not answer because he knew the challenge had already collapsed beneath signed facts and court files. Then Evelyn Brooks reached for a smaller sealed envelope and said there was one final item left for me. Edward Carter had written a personal letter, and she asked whether I consented to a portion being read aloud there. I nodded because my throat had closed, and hearing his voice again mattered more than maintaining composure. Evelyn Brooks unfolded the handwritten page, and his familiar script instantly dissolved the professional distance of the room. He wrote that if the letter was being read aloud, then events had unfolded exactly as he predicted they would. He said my biological family had come seeking money. They never earned that from a man they never truly cared for. He apologized that I had to endure the spectacle, but said he knew I was strong enough to withstand it. A small broken sound escaped Vanessa Carter, almost like a whimper, though no one looked at her now. The letter said I came to him as a wounded child, discarded by those who should have protected me. He wrote that I transformed pain into determination, loneliness into independence, and rejection into resilience over 15 years. He told me he had never been more proud of anyone in his entire life, and I let the tears fall. Then came the line that will stay with me forever. He did not save me. He gave me a place to save myself. He wrote that every achievement, my education, career, and character, had been earned through my own effort and discipline. He said he was leaving me the estate not because I needed rescue, but because I deserved trust and stewardship. He said he knew I would use those resources to help others the way he had tried to help me. Finally, he told me not to feel guilty for surviving them and never to let them back in by force. He ended the letter by saying, I owed them nothing. I owed myself everything, and he loved me forever as my father. Vanessa Carter stood again, but now anger had dissolved into a performance of wounded motherhood and late regret. She called me sweetheart and said she knew mistakes had been made, but blood was blood, and families could heal. Then, within the same breath, she asked whether we could at least discuss dividing the estate in some fair way. I wiped my face and told her she had surrendered the right to call me sweetheart 15 years earlier. She turned desperately to Charles Whitmore and demanded that he announce they would contest the will immediately. He finally spoke, but the confidence had vanished, replaced by the hollow tone of a man cornered by his own choices. He suggested they discuss options privately, because even he no longer wanted his arguments spoken aloud in that room. Before he could retreat, Evelyn Brooks rotated her tablet and revealed an email thread that stunned everyone present. It was a 2022 message from Edward Carter, terminating Charles Whitmore as counsel over unacceptable estate advice. In that email, Edward Carter said Charles Whitmore kept advocating for Michael Carter despite years of exploitation. He specifically objected to pressure to include a brother who had mistreated me and financially betrayed him for decades. Evelyn Brooks then stated the obvious conflict. Charles Whitmore had once represented Edward Carter in estate matters. Yet he had taken a case against that estate without disclosing his prior relationship or the conflict to his clients. Vanessa Carter turned to him in disbelief because the lawyer who promised victory had hidden the rot in his own position. Charles Whitmore gathered his briefcase with shaking hands and said he needed to review documents before continuing further. He was already moving toward the door while Vanessa Carter called after him, her voice rising with fresh panic. The door closed behind him softly, and abandonment changed sides inside that room for the first time in years. Michael Carter had not spoken in several minutes. He sat slumped, staring downward as if collapse might hide him. Chloe Carter began crying quietly, and I could not tell whether she mourned money, humiliation, or something older and sadder. Vanessa Carter turned back to me one last time and asked whether we were still family because blood remained blood. I stood and told her that on July 15th, 2010, she and Michael Carter ended that claim themselves. I said I did not hate her, and I even felt sorry for her, but she no longer had any claim on me. Then I asked Evelyn Brooks to continue with the remaining articles because the will was bigger than their collapse. Vanessa Carter sat down heavily and did not speak again for the rest of the proceedings that afternoon. Article 9 detailed charitable bequests, and the atmosphere of the room shifted from scandal toward legacy and purpose. Edward Carter left $500,000 to Seattle Children's Hospital for scholarships serving disadvantaged children. He left $300,000 to Habitat for Humanity Northwest for affordable housing in the greater Seattle area. He left $200,000 to the Olympic National Park Foundation for preservation and environmental education work. Dr. Rebecca Collins said Edward Carter had been one of their most consistent donors for over 2 decades. A Habitat representative explained to CNN that his previous gifts had already helped build multiple homes for families in need. Then Evelyn Brooks read a clause asking me to continue his charitable traditions according to my own judgment. I said I would honor everything Edward Carter built, because generosity had always been part of his real estate legacy. In that moment, I understood why the charity witnesses had been invited to the reading despite having no legal necessity. Edward Carter wanted impartial people there to see the truth unfold, so no later lie could rewrite the scene. Dr. Rebecca Collins caught my eye and told me he spoke proudly of me at every board event she attended. Even in death, Edward Carter had surrounded me with witnesses who knew exactly who he had chosen and why. When the final articles were complete, Evelyn Brooks asked whether I wanted to say a few words to the room. I had not planned a speech, but the moment demanded honesty, not performance, and my voice found its own direction. I said Edward Carter took me in at 13 when I had nothing and gave me home, education, and choice. I thanked the employees who had watched me grow from intern to chief financial officer under his patient mentorship. I promised the properties would be managed with the same integrity and steadiness that Edward Carter had demanded. I also announced a new STEM scholarship in his name for students from difficult family situations who needed belief. Then I addressed my biological relatives without using their names, because names are not always the deepest truth. I said I held no grudge, but peace did not require denial, and healing did not require reopening closed doors. I said family is not biology alone. It is the people who stand beside you when everything else falls apart. By that definition, many people in that room were more my family than those who merely shared my DNA. When I sat down, there was a long silence, and then Daniel Foster began to clap from near the window. Others joined him, not wildly, but with the solemn respect people offer when truth has cost someone dearly. At 3:47, Evelyn Brooks formally concluded the reading and said the estate could now move toward transfer. People stood, conversations resumed quietly, and the room began releasing the tension it had held for nearly 2 hours. Michael Carter moved first toward the door, still unable to meet anyone's eyes, especially mine or his own wife's. Chloe Carter followed after gathering her purse, silent and pale, carrying more than embarrassment on her face. Vanessa Carter lingered for a final moment and looked back at me with smeared makeup and collapsed pride. Her lips formed what might have been the beginning of an apology, but no sound came, and she walked away. I watched her leave and felt not triumph, not revenge, but the strange emptiness that comes when a chapter ends. Afterward, Dr. Rebecca Collins approached me and said, Edward Carter called taking me in the best choice of his life. She handed me a business card and told me to call when I was ready to discuss the scholarship fund. Then Sophia Ramirez came to my side, squeezed my arm, and said Edward Carter would be deeply proud of me. I hoped she was right, though part of me already knew he had prepared every detail because he trusted me fully. 1 week later, Evelyn Brooks filed a complaint with the state bar over Charles Whitmore's ethical misconduct. I did not ask her to do it. She acted because professional responsibility demanded reporting what she had witnessed. The complaint listed conflict of interest, failure to disclose prior representation, and misrepresentation to his current clients. He had previously represented Edward Carter and acquired confidential information tied directly to the same estate challenge. He never told Vanessa Carter or Michael Carter about that prior role before taking their case against the estate. He also led them to believe they had a strong challenge when the legal foundation was compromised from the start. In late May 2025, the Bar Association issued its ruling after reviewing the complaint and supporting evidence. Charles Whitmore was suspended from practicing law for 6 months, fined $15,000, and ordered into ethics training. Within weeks, several major clients quietly left his firm, and gossip said the financial damage spread quickly afterward. Sofia Ramirez once asked whether I felt satisfied watching his professional decline after everything he tried to do. I told her I had not ruined him. He had built his own downfall through greed, arrogance, and concealment. Some people believe they are clever enough to outrun consequence until paperwork and timing finally catch their heels. 3 weeks after the will reading, an email arrived from Vanessa Carter with the subject line, "Please read." She wrote a longer message than I expected, claiming she had reflected deeply on the reading and her mistakes. But even in apology, she stayed vague, blaming pressure, finances, and overwhelm instead of naming what she had done. She insisted she was not asking for money, only a chance to make things right because blood remained blood. She still signed the message as Mom, as though biology alone could restore a title she surrendered herself. I read the email 3 times, then called Dr. Natalie Brooks and read it aloud over the phone. She asked what I noticed most, and I said the message apologized without accountability and reached toward access without repair. After 2 days, I sent a 4-sentence reply that took longer to craft than some business contracts ever had. I told Vanessa Carter I had forgiven her long ago for my own peace, but wanted no relationship. I also asked her not to contact me again, because clarity is kinder than false hope stretched into resentment. She never replied, and for the first time, silence felt like a clean boundary rather than a punishment. 2 months later, an actual letter arrived with a Portland postmark and the return address, Chloe Bennett. I opened it expecting more manipulation, but what I found felt startlingly different from anything my family had sent before. Chloe Bennett wrote that she was not asking for money, forgiveness, or even contact. She only needed to speak truth. She confessed that the night I was thrown out, she watched me from her bedroom window for 4 hours. She said she saw me alone in the dark beside those garbage bags and never came down to sit with me. She admitted she could have brought water, comfort, or even a single sentence of solidarity, but chose cowardice instead. That failure, she wrote, had haunted her ever since, especially whenever our mother blamed me for what happened. She said she was not asking me to forgive her, only to know that she understood she had failed me. I read the letter 4 times because it was the first truly honest statement anyone in my biological family had made. It did not excuse, soften, redirect, or ask for money. It simply named a moral failure and owned it. For the first time in many years, when I thought about Chloe Bennett, I felt something other than distance. 4 months after the will reading, I finally answered her, but only after long conversations with Dr. Natalie Brooks. Therapy helped me separate obligation from desire, because appearing generous is not the same as choosing what is healthy. To my surprise, I did not want to shut Chloe Bennett out completely, though I was nowhere near trust. So I wrote back with conditions, careful ones designed to protect the life I had built from further intrusion. First, there would be no messages through Vanessa Carter or Michael Carter, because that door was permanently closed. Second, we would never discuss money, inheritance, or any matter related to Edward Carter's estate. Third, I reserved the right to end communication at any moment, without explanation, and that silence must be respected. If she accepted those boundaries, we could begin with a monthly video call lasting only 15 low-pressure minutes. I made it clear this was not forgiveness rewritten as family restoration. It was only cautious exploration on my terms. Her reply arrived 3 days later and contained only one word, accepted, which told me more than a long plea could. We scheduled our first call for a Saturday afternoon in September 2025, exactly 6 months after the reading. As 2 o'clock approached, my heart pounded harder than it had during the legal confrontation with my parents. Defending myself in public had felt safer than choosing vulnerability in private with someone who once watched and did nothing. When the call connected, Chloe Bennett looked less polished than before, more tired and strangely more real. We stared at each other for a moment, both aware that 15 years sat heavily between our 2 faces. She admitted she had not been sure I would actually answer, and I confessed I had almost declined. That honesty broke the tension enough for a nervous laugh, the first almost normal sound we had shared in years. We kept the conversation light, just as I had requested, staying near the surface where danger felt manageable. She told me she was training to become a nail technician and working toward licensure with determined patience. She mentioned her children, Ethan Bennett and Mia Bennett, but carefully did not ask me to play any role. I told her about Seattle weather, the business, and ordinary routines, revealing little but listening more than expected. At 14 minutes, I said we should wrap up, keeping the boundary intact exactly as I had planned. Before I could end the call, Chloe Bennett thanked me for giving her even a small chance to begin again. I told her this was only step one, and that step one was all I was offering for now. She said step one was already more than she had expected, and in that restraint, I heard sincerity. We scheduled another call for the next month, and after the screen went dark, I sat thinking for a long time. I did not know whether we would ever become real sisters or remain two people meeting carefully at a bridge, but for the first time, I was the one deciding what closeness meant, what risk was acceptable, and what stayed closed. That power, chosen rather than seized, felt worth more than inheritance, more than victory, and more than public vindication. On March 14th, 2026, exactly 1 year after the will reading, I stood outside a modest commercial building. It was the first property Edward Carter ever purchased in 1987, back when he was 34 and still building everything. Renovations had refreshed the structure, but that day I came for something more enduring than windows or landscaping. A bronze plaque beside the entrance now named it the Edward R. Carter Building in loving memory and gratitude. I touched the cold metal letters and felt a peace deeper than the courtroom satisfaction people often imagine. In the year since the reading, Carter property holdings had grown again, reaching $26.5 million in value. Occupancy stayed above 95%. 2 new properties were added, and 3 older ones received meaningful upgrades. More importantly, the Edward Carter STEM Scholarship funded its first 5 students from difficult family backgrounds. Each recipient received full support for summer science and mathematics programs, the kind of chance I once nearly lost. Dr. Rebecca Collins helped select the recipients, making the scholarship an extension of both compassion and rigorous hope. Chloe Bennett and I still spoke once each month, and the calls had gradually grown from 15 minutes to 25. We were not sisters in any ordinary, easy sense, but we were becoming something honest, deliberate, and carefully real. I had seen photographs of Ethan Bennett and Mia Bennett, and she had seen pictures of my apartment and office. Meanwhile, Vanessa Carter and Michael Carter had stopped trying to contact me, and I no longer needed updates. Their lives might still be messy, defensive, or lonely, but my healing no longer required any information about them. Sophia Ramirez joined me beside the plaque that day and asked quietly whether I was all right. I thought for a moment and answered that I was not simply happy. I was peaceful, which felt greater. Edward Carter had taught me that family is chosen through love, action, loyalty, and the courage to stay. Thus, the hardest lesson, though, was learning to choose myself with the same certainty he had once chosen me. Looking back now, I understand my childhood through the lens of conditional self-worth and earned permission to exist. For 13 years, I believed I mattered only if certain people approved of me, especially Vanessa Carter. Her indifference felt like evidence that I was defective, forgettable, and somehow responsible for not being loved correctly. What saved me was never money alone, not even inheritance. It was unconditional acceptance from Edward Carter. He saw who I was without demanding I become someone else first, and that changed the architecture of my life. So if there is one truth I want this story to leave behind, it is this. Know your worth without permission. You are allowed to set boundaries, even with parents, even with blood, even when others call that boundary cruel. Forgiveness is something you may choose for your own peace, but reconciliation is a separate choice entirely. No one gets to demand both from you simply because they share your last name or your earliest memories. Your story belongs to you, and so does the right to decide who remains in it after the truth arrives. I survived people who tried to make me feel disposable, and I built a life they could not imagine. If you are standing in the ruins of someone else's rejection, please hear me clearly. You are not what they did. The right people will not ask you to shrink, disappear, or compete for basic dignity before they call it love. Sometimes the family who saves you is the one that chooses you later, more honestly than blood ever did. Sometimes justice is not loud triumph, but calm distance, clean paperwork, and the refusal to reopen a closed wound. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is build a beautiful future in the space they meant as exile. That is the story of how Amelia Carter lost one family, found another, and finally learned to choose herself.